Well, hey there, and welcome to episode number 4 of Groove, the No Treble podcast, which you can always find at www.notreble.com. My name is Mitch Joel. It's Thursday, April 2nd, 2015. Let's get on with the show. So who are you and what do you do?
I'm Gary Willis. I'm a musician, bass player, composer, educator, human being.
And a guy who is, I think, very well known in the bass circles. And it was interesting that you called yourself a musician first. Is that intuitive, or is that just by the way things popped into your head?
I don't know. I felt like since I'm on a bass centric thing, I thought I'd broaden it a little bit, that's all.
I think I want to start off with you having you talk a little bit about where you see the genre of music that I think you're best known for, which would be jazz, obviously. How do you see, like, what is the state of jazz for you?
I think the future's really cloudy. It's really hard to project what to tell people they'll be doing, with, their ability to play music, in 10 years. Because the history of how someone can have a lifestyle with this music has been like under siege, for the last 10 years or so more, with the way that music is being perceived, how it's being demonetized, how how it's been devalued in a way. So it's hard to tell anybody that's trying to learn, what they should be doing to prepare for the future.
Is that? As someone who knows the world, it doesn't sound like that's sort of just jazz. It sounds like that's anybody interested in being a musician. It sort of sounds like the area you're going down.
Yeah, it's general, I would say. Jazz itself will have its percentages of people that are attracted to it. Like I was attracted to it, but it's a mystery to me.
Do you remember when you first got attracted to jazz? Like, were you extremely young? Was it once you really held an instrument?
I was actually, what drew me to music, instrumental music, was first of all just instrumental cuts off of records that I'd buy, and what I realized is that music without words didn't force me to such a specific interpretation. So it was like a much more abstract thing. So the abstract nature of instrumental music just led me to the jazz section eventually of the record store.
Was it? So, go ahead.
No, so it's mainly the abstract nature, the possibility of identifying with a piece of music that it's not so tied down to a specific set of words.
But it sounds to me, as I hear you say that happened later in life. It wasn't like you were always a jazz guy.
No, I wasn't always a jazz guy, but I was just kind of trying to discover music that I could identify with. And so I was in my early teens, I'm sure, around that time. And I everything on the radio I could play on bass, and I was learning stuff on guitar. But like I said, the nature of instrumental music kind of drew me toward it.
It's funny, that moment in time typically drives people to like Rush. That's what I think.
Yeah, no, I kind of missed the whole rock thing. I never was in garage rock bands.
It's somewhat strange, and I'm sure you can appreciate this, to hear that story and think that, like, as a teenager you sort of go. It's like that's not common for a teenager, I don't think. But I guess it does speak to the sophistication of how you were taking on music versus a lot of your peers at that time. I mean, most teenagers would be thrilled to play half of the songs you could probably play, and we're sort of satisfied with that. They weren't looking for more.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily in bands that played this music, but I didn't find a challenge in it. So like, I got a bass when I was 13, got a guitar when I was 15, and I started learning music through the guitar mostly. But I wasn't really in bands that much.
It speaks to your musicality, that though, doesn't it? In terms of, I think, how you approach the bass and how you think about where the bass fits in the grander scheme of music. That musicality of the guitar versus the sort of holding the back and the bass in the back. It does
Yeah,
feel to me
well,
like, yeah, go ahead.
no, that was apparent to me at a certain point when I had to pay back a loan that they wouldn't extend to go to college, and I had to sell my Les Paul or my Precision, and I kind of based my decision on the bands that I played in. When I played guitar, it didn't really matter how well I played guitar. If the rhythm section wasn't happening, I didn't really feel the music. And when I was playing bass in the bands, the music felt like it should, So I understood that to be, that's where my instincts were.
When you think about those instincts and what you were doing, can you self-reflect on the early days of what you were doing alone in that practice room when you were playing the bass? Can you see where the evolution went from I'm learning songs and I'm understanding music to what has become, without a doubt, I mean, the Gary Willis sound? I mean, you have a
Hmm.
very, very unique approach to this instrument.
Mm. Um, Actually, I was kind of, although I was applying myself to guitar, it got to a point where on bass, because that's where I remember making this decision, is that I'd kind of skated by on natural ability and a good ear for a few years. And by my third year in college, I decided, look, I'm not going to get any better unless I start figuring out how to practice. The problem was is that I didn't have an instructor on the instrument. So at that point, I had to start evaluating how to get better on this instrument, because I remember hearing records of, you know, Joe Pass and Oscar Peterson and not having the first clue about what to take, steps to take to get in that direction. Um, so it was fairly isolated, really isolated as far as how I got, got familiar with the instrument and how I started applying, trying to solve problems on it.
So what was that process?
The process, and this is something I recommend to everybody that asks me about it. The process for me ended up, it has to be creative. I felt like it was a creative process because what happened is I would try to create music, and anytime try to create music, I would figure out, I would see problems, I would observe problems, and I would create a solution to those problems. So I try to tell anybody that's trying to figure out what to do with their free practice time is like try to make 50% of it at least creative, and just you know access that portion of your brain that can create music and also create solutions. Because when creating those solutions, you'll develop your own technique and eventually your own sound.
It's interesting that you say that because a lot of times you'll hear very well-known bass players talk about how they just slog it out in the clubs and just playing live and you just sort of fix your stuff and get your chops and everything live. Your approach,
Mm.
and again, correct me if I'm wrong, sounds a lot about also working in isolation, just you and the instrument.
Yeah, it was that. I mean, of course, I did once I got to North Texas State. That was where I really I got immersed in a lot of playing experience. Um, um, but as far as just advances on the instrument itself, that was just like I said, like that. I tell the story because I did go through this period where I heard everybody talking about that guy practices 8 hours a day, you know. And so I figured I need to be this guy. So I spent like a couple of weeks, like getting up early before classes, in between classes, late at night, all day practicing. And at the end of 2 weeks, I hated music. I wasn't any better, and I gave up. So what I discovered was that at that time I had to Um, the applied instrument that I could take lessons on was classical upright bass, and I'd never used a bow before, and so I really sucked. And the only bass instruments you could use were ones that you signed up for, and so in a specific time. So I went and practiced my specific time and wasn't getting any better, and I knew I wasn't going to have a future in the instrument. So I just I started procrastinating. I put it off until the weekend, late at night when musicians are, normally more active. And I maybe only practiced once or twice during the week, and I got better.
Do you look at that and think that you just sort of, because there are people who say it, I mean, I believe it too, that, there are people who can sing and there are people who can't. Do you look at this and go, there is this sort of unknown reason, but you are given this gift, you're given this gift of a natural ability, a good ear, and that you happen to, once you picked up that bass, really realize you are in touch with this instrument? Is it like an
Uh,
unspoken,
hmm.
unknown thing to you?
No, I was definitely not in touch with the upright.
Hmm.
I made improvements, but I definitely was not in touch with that instrument. Um,
But electric?
yeah, but electric. Yeah, I had, like I said, I reached a point probably a couple of years into my pursuing college. I reached a point where I realized, look, I'm not going to get any better unless I start trying to figure this out and practice on my own myself. So, I remember at one point, let's see, there was a guy, there was a jury, like there was an upright player, and we'd try. He didn't really have a clue about bass, and so I would try to take lessons from him. I did like one semester, and there was a jury, and at the end of it, one of the guys said, "Do you have a metronome?" you know, like there was just a lot of things that were not natural to me. I had to figure out how to solve it myself.
That's crazy. So when you hear something like that, because that's a statement that could send people in two directions, right? One direction is, I got to figure this out, which is clearly, Gary, the
hmm
direction you took. But that
hmm
can also be one of those things where, I'm just not going to be that type of player. Again, if you could self-reflect and think about your creative process, did you
hmm
just intuitively know, like, this is the electric bass, this is for me. I get this. I'm good.
Oh, no, I struggle with that, especially when I was at North Texas State, because when I got there, there were enough musicians to field 11 big bands, and that's a double rhythm section. So there's like 20 or 30 bass players, at the school, and they were all better than me. They all had more experience. They could read. I was pretty much musically illiterate. And so I had to struggle, and I had to struggle with this concept of I had an idea of what I could do, but what I could do at the time wasn't even really close to it. And so and even when I first moved to LA in like 83, 82, I remember going to places and people were hearing me play, and I knew I still wasn't where I wanted to be musically. But you have to accept that people are going to judge you for where you are and not where you think you are. So you have to kind of have this self-confidence that, or some kind of vision of what you think you can do.
So fast forward this for me to being reflective in the moment. When did you know it clicked, or at what point in your career were you like, okay, now I've got this and I've got all of those pieces together? Was there a
Um,
moment, or is it?
mm, it's like no, I'd never really looked at things like that. Like there was a moment. It's like I hate to be cliche, but it's kind of a journey. It's like um, as soon as you stop learning, then that's when you're kind of dead. So there were some kind of self realization things that happened to me while I was in LA. Um, One thing is that the there was LA's at that time, and still maybe not now so much, but at that time was really known for its studio, the potential for studio work. And I was not a good reader, and I felt, subconscious in those situations. And the only time I ever really worked on my reading was when I first moved to LA, and I had no gigs for 6 months. And so I used to beat myself up about not trying to take advantage of this opportunity to play studio music, and it finally dawned on me that as a musician, if I'm not playing music that I believe in, that I feel strongly about, I'm not a good employee. I'm not I'm not good to. I'm not nice to be around. I get dark. So that was one thing I learned about myself, and at the same time, opportunities came up where I could teach. And since I'd gone this journey on my own and found my own unique ways to get from point A to point B, I could share this with people, and it never bothered. Teaching never felt like it was beneath me. And so instead of trying to pursue that studio guy, chameleon type thing, I started just playing, in bands with music that I wanted to play with, and I made up for it by teaching in my spare time.
In relation to that, when do you meet Scott Henderson?
I was about my second year. We started Treble Tech in '84, so it was second year in LA.
So you meet Scott, and is that about you saying, I'm not going to be a session guy, it's got to be about the music, and we got to do this?
No, that didn't happen until 5 or 6 years later, I think. At the time, around the '84, I think I started playing with Holsworth. He started playing with Zawinul. Then I played with Wayne Shorter. And so we were using these connections to try to promote our group, which is, was kind of a side project. And it wasn't until maybe 4 or 5 years later that we both agreed, okay, we're going to make Treble Tech a priority and not, cancel any gigs or opportunities based on somebody else's schedule. So I was still, the side man, and we both looked at Treble Tech as something that we were trying to promote while we were doing these other high profile gigs.
Does the success of it put into question the things you were doing before? Because in one sense, you're saying, I'm happy to sit back and teach. I was happy to work on music that, meant something to you. But Treble Tech is about Gary being frontal, as I would best describe, which it does seem, based off of the way you're describing your journey, is a bit anachromatic to who you are.
Well, when I first moved to town, I was taking any gig, any rehearsal, anything I could do. And later on, when I got a little more exposure, I was, and even after playing with Wayne Shorter, I was still going out and substituting for people, playing weddings, playing things. It wasn't like I had achieved stardom or something like that. So it wasn't until maybe like 90 or 91 that I was still playing original bands. Treble Tech had a few CDs out. We kind of just started touring, I think. And I finally, just had this kind of conversation with myself, and I decided that I was not going to play music, with anyone unless the people came to hear the music, and that was like a big step for me. Which meant saying no to playing with my friends in situations where the music was not so serious. It's like background music or in clubs where it's a meat market, or, So, it was a good 7 or 8 years before I could just say, okay, this is all I'm going to do is the music I'm interested in.
But that's interesting, because it really is this sort of, not just a declaration, but it's almost like you're taking ownership and a responsibility for what you're putting out there, instead of just being paid to put stuff out there. And maybe I'm being nuanced with that, but I find that really interesting from a creative and musician prospect, because you really are taking a different level of responsibility for what I'll put in air marks as success.
Yeah, I mean, it was a risk. I had to say no to people, and but it was easier because it wasn't judging them or judging their music. It was like just, is the situation people hearing music or not? And then it wasn't till maybe 2 or 3 years after that that I finally was working enough with Treble Tech that I decided I didn't want to be a sideman anymore. I didn't really want to spend all this time learning and playing other people's music. That wasn't as satisfying.
So you do that and you make the jump, and it's obviously successful. I mean, Tribal Tech is everyone knows Tribal Tech. Do do you do you realize while it's happening that one, this is really sort of capturing an audience in a way I'm sure was somewhat surprising to you, and then two, that there was an acceptance of not just the music of Tribal Tech, but you as a bass player. There was something different happened in that time.
Well, it sure didn't. It didn't feel like it.
It's nice to hear, though, right?
Yeah, it's nice to hear. In retrospect, we worked hard. We made a lot of sacrifices, and as far as respect, yes. But at the time we were doing it, we were, it was four guys in a van carrying our own equipment, driving all over the U.S., risking our lives daily, um, playing for peanuts. We weren't really making money. So we
It's
made a lot
jazz,
of.
man. It's jazz,
Yeah,
right? You have
we were.
extreme popularity and there's no money.
Yeah, we were making a lot of sacrifices. In retrospect, people think, "Oh, yeah, you're just the super band that we're just enjoying all this success." And man, we'd play gigs sometimes, and it would be like 8 people, or gigs would get canceled. I mean, there was a lot of risk associated with it, So,
I'm curious, Gary, with all of the work you've done and the complexity of the work you've done, and I do think complexity is a fair word to put
mhm,
across in terms of what you do.
mhm.
How do you think about finding that unique voice through the bass for what you do in the music you do, like today?
um, how do I think for other people to do it?
No, for you. Like, I mean, you're still finding, I believe, at
Ah,
least when I hear
yeah,
your music, that you're
hmm
finding, you're constantly really trying to have a way for the bass to say something in the music.
yeah.
And I mean, it's nuanced, but it's not easy to do. It's a very complex thing to do with the instrument as it is.
Yeah, I mean, you have to, if you develop certain skills on the instrument, you develop a sound, you develop a tone or whatever, and that's really not enough. Um, I mean, this is something that kind of came to a realization, and I don't think people take it the wrong way, but I would listen to Jocko with Weather Report, and then I would hear Jocko in other situations and he would be playing exactly the same stuff and it just didn't have nearly as much meaning. When you surround a vocabulary or a sound or a technique or a way of playing, when you surround it with great arrangements, great compositions, great musicianship and everything, it has a much greater impact. And so that's one thing I realized, at least for myself, is that just doing these things on the instrument is not enough. You've got to create an environment for this stuff to be justified, for it to express itself in.
How do you
It's
go
sort of
on?
like it's sort of like I mean, you can have amazing acting chops, but if you're with a crappy script or director, that part of it's the place where you present yourself, or the environment where it can flourish has to exist. And so I really, that's all I concentrate on anymore. Is creating that environment to justify it, or to put the bass in.
So if I were to fast forward today and somewhat look back, you're a guy who has become this teacher through the
hmm
publication of books. You've had
hmm
it through, I mean, I would even say just by the simple fact that Ibanez has a Gary Willis signature bass. I mean, you are
hmm
sort of known as that. When you
Hmm.
sit down today, what's your creative process like when you have those things now in place? I mean, when you're building, it's I'd love to teach, I'd love to get a book out, I'd love people to recognize me, I'd love for there not to be 8 people in the room and to really be a super group. And you sort of do come to that point and you come through the other side. And the reason I'm asking you this is because you talked about, finding that sound and tone. And I think what a lot of people in the music industry would say is finding that sound and tone is sometimes the most stifling thing that happens because you're expected to now be like this, right? Bob Dylan is expected to be like Bob Dylan.
Hmm.
And as you mature and as you sort of look towards what you do day in and day out, does your creative process change?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think you have to. You because if I was still making, I mean, I kind of went through this thing where I made a couple of my first two solo CDs, and those were with great musicians, and I was real lucky to have those released. And then I moved here, and I felt like I wanted to do approach it differently. I didn't want to be stuck with just a performance because those were done like in a couple of days, the basic tracks. And I felt like I wanted to have a little bit more control and more flexibility with the final product instead of basing it on gathering musicians, writing the music, rehearsing it, and playing it. Been there, done that. So I spent, I completely went a different direction with the CD Actual Fiction, where it was all kind of composed as it was performed, as it was edited, as I was learning about how to get sound out of the studio, and so that was a big learning process for me because I pretty much, except for some of the drums, I did like everything myself. And that approach, I decided no way in hell I was going to do that again immediately afterwards. So I did retro a couple years ago, and that was just fretless Rhodes and drums. And so yeah, the approach changes a lot of times because you're just sick of the old one. There's a thing about there's a thing I tell people that are learning about a vocabulary on the instrument is that the main thing to establish is the connection between your imagination and the bass. And your vocabulary is going to change just like your speaking vocabulary does, as styles change, as your understanding of words change, as words evolve. You're not gonna play, or you're not gonna talk the way you did 5 years ago. So as my vocabulary and as my fluency in the studio changes, and I don't know, hopefully still evolving.
Do you consider yourself, I'd call it ambidextrous? Are you as comfortable in the studio as you are live? Are you sort of more of a studio? Like, how would you perceive where you sort of feel the most joy?
Oh, you know what? That's kind of, actually, I have to answer that really philosophically.
That's why we're
Sorry,
here.
but really, the only way I've been able to cope with playing live is to not care, and that means that what that means is that I care like hell, practicing, rehearsing, getting everything together, being a musician, taking care of all the things that you have to take care of up until the downbeat. Once the music starts, then you have to not care what happens. So you can't really try to embrace or try to hold on to this moment of playing live and want it to be something and have this connection with the audience and have it be great. And because once you start wanting that too bad, then you're going to start making decisions based on how it felt last time you played. And you're gonna start cheating yourself of being open to creativity and there's so many misinterpretations of what can happen when you play in front of an audience. And it's like you can, there's like don't know what the math is and the possible combinations, but you can play great. You can feel bad about it, and the audience can feel bad about it, and then you listen back, and it was cool. Other times you think it's cool. The audience thinks it's cool. You listen back, and it's horrible. And then there's variations on all those, you know.
And there's emotions too. Like, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I do a lot of public speaking where I'll get off stage and I'll feel like, the words just weren't coming out of the mouth properly. And people are like, that was the best thing I've ever seen, right? Or because there's also just sort of like how you feel. It's the weirdest experience.
Yeah. So I don't really look at at playing live as anything to try to hold on to. I just try to get ready for it, and I just try to let it happen. And sometimes the amazing things happen, and sometimes things really suck, and you by not caring, then it's easier to enjoy when it's happening, and it's easier to live with yourself when it's not,
Being a bass player is also a very unique thing, and I'm discovering this in my journey of speaking to bass greats like yourself, and it is a peculiar community. It's a peculiar type of place to be. When you think about its place in music, how would you define it? Like when you're talking to people who are not in the community about what you do, how do you sort of express, I would guess, because it's a heavy importance. It's your life, this thing.
Wow. I'm not sure I could have that conversation except that I could explain what I do, because how the bass is perceived and how people do it are not decisions that I would make.
But
I've actually let that define me. A big part of who I've become, I suppose, is listening to people and going, I never want to sound like that. So to explaining to a stranger what I do, I'm not sure I could do that except just, explain my approach.
What do you mean when you say I never want to sound like that in terms of what they're playing, their timing, or is it just more of just a feel soul thing?
It's more of like it has to do with the role of the bass and taking responsibility for the direction of the music. Because so many bass players are satisfied with just being in the background and not really influencing the music and not participating in its direction and development. And that's fine, and I don't fault people for making that choice. But when I hear that passivity, in a bass player, I skip it. Next.
Well, that is interesting, though, because, and that's sort of where I was going with the question. So you answered it, but this idea that, most people see the bass as relegated to rhythm section or the back. You've turned it, and I think it speaks to when you said you're a musician. You are one of the people who've drawn a line in the sand and said, no, this is a primary musical instrument. It deserves its place in the spotlight.
Yeah, or not necessarily. It wouldn't have to be. You wouldn't have to call it a spotlight, but it would have to be one of the players. One of the influencers. In a band. That if you approach it the right way and you bring the right things to it, then you can influence the intensity, the impact, the feel, the direction, a lot of things. And it's not about me. I'm not trying to be a control freak, but it's feeling like I'm contributing,
What component of being a bass player is most inspiring to you today?
In listening to someone else. No, is that the question?
Well, I mean, that could be one direction. I would also say just in terms of your own desire to grow.
It's the same criteria I have for any musician. It's just imagination. How big is your imagination? How unexpected and deep can things go? You know, where and how surprising, how where can what are the possibilities? Are they are they huge? Or they're limited? You know.
Is it the classic sort of student-teacher relationship where a lot of what you're doing in the teaching is helping you progress more than the students probably realize?
Um, yeah, in a way, having to put into words what I discovered on my own, sure, yeah, that's helped me, formalize the ideas that I had in my head. Um, but that's all. It makes it but actually not really. I mean, having students mainly helped me become a better communicator.
Hmm. That's interesting how that happens and how it does
Yeah.
influence the physicality of what you play.
Well, I'm not sure it's influenced my playing.
Okay.
Because I really don't try to be conscious when I'm playing. I really try not to think. The more tired I am, the better I play. Less
Loose.
my brain, less my brain is involved.
But I mean, is that a stressor because of who you are and what you're known for? That it feels to me like you're going to that place because then there's no pressure to be that Gary Willis guy.
Um, man, I don't.
I'm freaking you out. I
It,
won't freak you out now.
yeah, no, it never occurs to me. I mean, but in the context of talking about what I do, I mean, I'll tell people up front, that what they just listened to, you from song to song, you'll hear me play similar ideas,
Hmm.
you know, but I treat it like a language, and in every conversation, you're just gonna use some of the same words and same phrases. Hopefully, it's unique to that moment and belongs to what you're trying to say at the moment.
Do you find inspiration for your musicianship and your playing from the outside? I mean, there are some people who say, I get deeply inspired when I go to a museum. I get deeply inspired when I'm watching TV, whatever it might be. Are you able to sort of capture those moments, or you just think it's sort of the
Well,
life led?
no, I mean it would be presumptuous to say I've captured anything, but I'm like, to me, film is like much higher art form. Much deeper, much immersive, much more immersive. So I'm in awe of people, that do that well.
Talk a little bit about, you're playing now, you're super active. Do you have any sort of thoughts about like what is the legacy that I'm going to leave?
Mm,
Because a lot of people, they have their trajectory, they're in flow, and I think what you said is beautiful, and I think it's right in line with probably the greatest of the great musicians. This idea of it's a body of work, you're continually at it, but there has to be moments when you look at whether it's a biography or whatever, where you wonder,
mm,
I would do wonder like what my legacy will be as a musician.
mm. I that's a tricky subject. It's like, actually that was kind of like it was one of the drawbacks, but actually one of the benefits of being in Treble Tech, for example, is that we were really hard on each other. No one got to take themselves seriously. Nobody cut anybody slack. You know, and so in a way that resulted in some great music, because when things were average or below average or mediocre or whatever, we would call each other on it, and the music was better for it. We didn't care about anybody's feelings, you know. So I've kind of tried to maintain that attitude about myself. I don't really try to cut myself any slack, and I don't try to let myself take myself that seriously, you know. Of course, that didn't allow us to enjoy whatever we could have enjoyed at the time, but I think it made for some better music.
What do you see happening in the next, 5 to 10 years, both in terms of what you're doing and both in terms of just how the bass seems to be evolving?
Um, I don't know. Yeah, I'm still. I mean, I've got a CD that I'm finishing up maybe this month. That's back towards that thing of playing with people in the studio. Um, um, I've got an app that I'm developing. It's called Groove a Day, and so I'm reaching people that way. And I think there's more of this connection. It's not so much with playing yet, but it is with teaching, where I'm doing like master classes
Yeah.
online. So I think that that direction, I think, is where I mean, that's it's just going that way, whether I want it to or not, and I'm fine with it. Eventually, I can see where you could have an online like portal type presence, like stage or club, except that the performances are streamed and it's not so important. It's not so much about public attendance.
Yeah.
It's more like eyeballs online. So
Well, thanks so much for your time, Gary.
sure,
It's really a huge honor and a pleasure to speak to someone like you. And again, my hopes
well,
for this
thanks.
show is that people really get a different story from people like you than all this stuff you're doing. I think everyone knows the
Hmm.
gears and the guitars and the techniques.
Yeah,
So
yeah, right, right. I appreciate this approach.